Here is the first 6,000 plus words from the provided text. A racist police officer brazenly grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed it directly into the face of a black woman in a deserted parking lot, but he had no idea that her next move would not only leave him stunned but also completely turn the tables. What happened next? What made the officer freeze in his tracks? Join us to uncover this gripping story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more compelling content. Rachel Carter is a fire safety expert with over a decade of experience in assessing and improving safety systems in urban areas. Known for her determination, meticulousness, and ability to handle emergencies, she has built a strong reputation in the field. Rachel's work often requires intense focus and at times solitary efforts in seldom frequented environments. This has accustomed her to facing unexpected situations. That evening, Rachel had just finished inspecting the outdated fire suppression system of a large shopping mall in the suburbs. After a long day of work, she was packing up her tools in the vast but deserted parking lot. The dim yellow glow from the light poles cast a quiet yet isolating atmosphere. Dressed in a reflective vest and professional uniform, she blended into the scene like an ordinary worker. Ethan Bradley, a middle-aged police officer, sat in his patrol car parked in a far corner of the lot. His career, plagued by a series of mistakes and rash decisions, had reached a downward spiral, leaving him isolated from colleagues and society. Once harboring hopes of advancement, Ethan now faced frustration and anger, leading him to seek opportunities to assert his authority even in trivial matters. Ethan had once been a promising officer, earning praise from superiors during the early years of his career. However, a string of errors in critical missions, including a misjudgment during a pursuit that allowed a suspect to escape, had significantly tarnished his reputation. Colleagues who once respected him now kept their distance, viewing him as a failure. Sitting in his patrol car, Ethan's eyes has scanned the empty parking lot. He noticed a truck parked there longer than usual. Under the dim lights, he observed Rachel loading large equipment into her vehicle, fire extinguishers and tools that appeared industrial. A thought crossed Ethan's mind: these items, if tampered with, could be used for dangerous purposes. Could this be a cover for something illegal? Not just his work, but Ethan's personal life was also fractured. His wife, whom he deeply loved, had decided to leave him, taking their young son after enduring years of his temper and increasing bitterness. "If you don't change, Ethan, you'll lose everything," she had said before walking out. Those words, along with the loneliness they left behind, haunted him every day. Patrolling, the only thing that made Ethan feel valued, had now become a stage for him to assert authority. Any action by others that he deemed challenging often ignited the simmering anger within him. From his car, Ethan focused on Rachel as she carefully loaded fire extinguishers and tools into her truck. His suspicion grew. A woman working alone at this hour seemed unusual despite her professional attire. He interpreted it as an attempt to pose as an employee to conceal some illicit activity. Ethan saw this as an opportunity to escape the monotony of his shift and assert his authority without reporting to dispatch or requesting backup. He decided to approach Rachel, eager to uncover something illegal and prove his capability. He turned off his patrol car engine and stepped out with a confident yet imposing stride. His hand hovered over his utility belt, ready for any scenario, while his eyes stayed locked on Rachel's every move. Rachel, initially unaware of Ethan, sensed someone's presence as the heavy footsteps drew near. Turning around, she saw a police officer with a stern expression standing just a few feet away. "Good evening. What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp, his gaze fixed on the fire extinguishers and tools in Rachel's truck. Although surprised by his sudden appearance, Rachel maintained a calm demeanor and replied, "I just finished inspecting the fire suppression system in this mall. I'm cleaning up to leave now." Despite her clear and reasonable answer, Ethan's suspicious gaze remained. To him, the matter wasn't so simple. "Prove it," Ethan demanded, his voice commanding. "Do you have any paperwork to show you're authorized to work here at this hour?" Rachel sighed, feeling frustration rise. This wasn't the first time she had been misunderstood because of her job, but looking into Ethan's eyes, she realized he wasn't genuinely seeking the truth. He was merely looking for an opportunity to assert his authority. The confrontation had only just begun, and Rachel quickly understood that her quiet evening wasn't going to end peacefully. Rachel felt Ethan's scrutinizing gaze fixed on her, not just curious but laden with clear suspicion. The dim light of the parking lot did little to ease the tension steadily building between them. Ethan took a few steps closer to Rachel, his voice cold but authoritative. "What are you doing here at this hour, and why do you have all this equipment?" Rachel, maintaining her professional demeanor, turned to face Ethan. She understood this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with an overzealous law enforcement officer, but the aggressiveness underlying Ethan's tone made her feel more irritated than usual. "I just finished inspecting the fire suppression system in this shopping mall," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice calm. "The job took longer than expected, so I'm packing up to leave." Ethan remained unfazed. His eyes scanned the neatly organized equipment in Rachel's truck: large fire extinguishers, specialized toolkits, and several carefully wrapped technical documents, all of which seemed to deepen his suspicion. "Do you have any paperwork to prove that?" he asked, his tone growing sharper. Rachel sighed, lightly opened her bag and took out her employee ID and a certificate from her company, handing them to Ethan, this is my employee ID. I work for Metro Fire Safety Consultants. If you need, I can call the mall's management to verify. Ethan took Rachel's ID but barely glanced at it before handing it back as though the action was just a formality. In his mind, unfounded doubts began to form. Who works alone at this hour? Why would she need industrial equipment like this? He stepped back slightly, his hand resting on his utility belt. A subconscious gesture of authority. This paperwork doesn't prove anything. Anyone could forge something like this. Even your uniform doesn't prove you're legitimately working here. Rachel tried to stay composed, but the absurdity of Ethan's remarks was beginning to frustrate her. Look, I don't understand why you're questioning me, but I'm just doing my job. If you don't believe me, you can call the mall's management. They'll confirm that I have every right to be here. Ethan had no intention of calling anyone. He felt his authority being challenged by Rachel's calm and professional response. Instead of backing off, he became even more determined to assert his control over the situation. Trying to appear composed, Ethan took a step forward and asked in a softer tone, "Can you elaborate? These tools look very professional, but I need to be sure they're not being used for anything outside of work purposes." Ethan knew he needed a valid reason to dig deeper rather than appearing too overbearing. In his mind, he justified his persistence. "If I don't investigate thoroughly and something happens, I'll be held accountable." Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I've already explained everything clearly. I'm not hiding anything. Everything I have here is listed in my reports, and I'm happy to provide documentation if you require it." Despite her efforts to remain professional, Rachel could sense that Ethan wasn't interested in finding the truth. He was simply looking for an opportunity to wield his authority. His eyes no longer held curiosity but were now filled with desire to dominate and control. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Rachel responded, "I've done everything I can to cooperate with you. If you still don't believe me, I don't know what else I can do." Ethan squinted, his eyebrows narrowing in a clear expression of challenge. In his mind, this was no longer a simple inspection, it was an opportunity to assert his authority, something he had long lost in both his career and personal life. The tension escalated, with Ethan increasingly driven by his sense of failure and fragile power, while Rachel stood firm against the unreasonable imposition of a public official. The air in the parking lot grew heavier with each of Rachel's clear but dismissed answers. Ethan stood there, his hand lightly grazing his utility belt as his eyes continued to scan the truck and the meticulously organized equipment Rachel had loaded. In his mind, a storm of suspicion grew, fueled by a sense that he couldn't let this situation pass without action. These tools don't look like they're just fire safety, Ethan said, his tone now accusatory. "Who knows what else they could be used for? Do you know these fire extinguishers could be modified into weapons?" Rachel raised an eyebrow, unable to believe what she had just heard. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and restrained indignation. "Very serious," Ethan replied, stepping closer to her truck. "I have the authority to inspect all of this. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me taking a look, right?" Rachel held her ground, her gaze now colder. She no longer tried to de-escalate the situation, shifting instead to defend her rights. "No, you don't have the authority to inspect my equipment," Rachel said firmly but calmly. "These tools aren't for just anyone to handle. They're regulated, used for specialized purposes, and you don't have the expertise or the jurisdiction to inspect them." Ethan felt as though she had challenged him outright. The sensation of losing control, something he desperately tried to maintain, ignited his anger. His eyes flashed with irritation as he stepped even closer, closing the gap between them to just a few feet. "You're obstructing an officer in the performance of his duty. You know that, don't you?" Ethan said, his tone laced with threat. Rachel's refusal felt like a slap to Ethan's already fragile pride. He didn't just feel dismissed by her, he felt humiliated. Memories of his failures, colleagues avoiding him, superiors chastising him for his poor judgment seemed to surge back in that moment. "I don't need someone telling me whether I know or not," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. "I have the right to inspect if I see something suspicious, and you look very suspicious." Rachel could feel her frustration rising, but she fought to keep her composure. She knew arguing further would only escalate the situation. "You can call the mall's management or even your superior to verify, but I won't let you touch my equipment. They're delicate and can easily be damaged if mishandled." Rather than considering her words, Ethan interpreted them as a direct challenge. He couldn't tolerate being refused, especially when he was trying to assert his authority. "Who do you think you are to tell me what I can and can't do?" Ethan shot back, his voice now stripped of any calmness, replaced by barely contained rage. "I don't need anyone dictating how I do my job. I'll inspect it if I see fit." Rachel realized that Ethan was no longer acting as a police officer performing his duty. He was letting his emotions take over. "You're letting your emotions control you," Rachel replied, her voice still steady but firmer. "I haven't done anything wrong and I won't allow you to abuse your authority. If you want to proceed, call your superior here now." Ethan took another step forward, his hand brushing over his utility belt in what felt like an implicit threat. Rachel could feel the tension between them thickening, the situation growing more dangerous. "You should watch your tone," Ethan said, his voice low and menacing. "I'm not obligated to take orders from Someone like you. Rachel stared back at Ethan, her gaze unyielding. Though she understood she was dealing with someone willing to go to any lengths to assert his power, she refused to back down. The space between them was now charged with suffocating tension, and Rachel knew the situation would only escalate further unless Ethan chose to back off. The tension between Rachel and Ethan was so thick it seemed to compress the entire parking lot into an oppressive weight. Rachel stood firm, her gaze sharp but her demeanor calm. Ethan, however, could no longer maintain the composure his job demanded. Ended when Rachel refused his request for an inspection. Ethan felt an unbearable sense of humiliation. This defiance didn't just come from a woman he viewed as beneath him in authority, it also dredged up bitter memories of past failures. Months ago during a meeting, Ethan's superior had openly criticized him for his poor handling of a case. "If you don't improve, I don't see a future for you here," his commander had declared, silencing the entire room. Ethan, though he didn't argue back, felt his pride shatter under the pitying glances of his colleagues. Now as Rachel's skeptical gaze met his, Ethan didn't just see the woman in front of him, he saw every person who had ever looked down on him, his superiors, his co-workers, even his wife who had left him. "No one has the right to belittle me anymore," Ethan thought, his wounded pride morphing into a simmering rage. The feeling of failure consumed him again, and he decided that tonight he would regain control no matter the cost. These bitter thoughts grew sharper as Ethan reflected on his family. His wife, once the love of his life, had left him, unable to endure his domineering personality and constant irritability. The brief phone calls with his son, whom he rarely saw, only reminded Ethan that he had nothing left to hold on to outside of work, and now in front of him a stranger was refusing the demands of a police officer. To Ethan, it wasn't just disrespect, it was a glaring reminder of the failures he tried to bury. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to contain the anger boiling inside him. "I can't let her win, not this time." Stepped closer, his voice now sharp and commanding. "Don't you understand the situation? This isn't a request, this is an order. I'm performing my duty and you are required to comply. If you don't, there will be consequences." Rachel didn't flinch, she looked Ethan straight in the eye, her tone steady but resolute. "I've already explained I haven't done anything wrong, and I won't let you abuse your authority to create a problem where there isn't one. If you have an issue, call your superior." Rachel's calmness was like fuel to Ethan's fragile ego. He felt more challenged than ever. "You're trying to make this difficult for me, aren't you?" Ethan growled, stepping even closer until only a few feet separated them. "Who do you think you are, some kind of expert, someone who has the right to refuse me?" Rachel held her ground, but she could see that Ethan was no longer thinking rationally. His anger and feelings of inadequacy had completely taken over. Ethan abruptly pointed at Rachel's truck, his voice rising. "Fine, if you won't let me inspect, I'll do it myself, and if I find anything suspicious, you'll be arrested right here and now." Rachel frowned. "You don't have the authority to do that without a valid reason or a search warrant." Her words only deepened Ethan's sense of losing control. He didn't care about the rules anymore. To him, this wasn't about protocol. It was a battle he had to win. "You don't get to tell me what I can or can't do," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the empty parking lot. "You'll regret it if you don't comply with me." Even though Rachel recognized she was dealing with someone on the verge of losing complete control, she refused to back down. She took a step back, maintaining a safe distance, her voice firm and clear. "You're crossing the line, and you know it. I've provided all the necessary information and documentation. If you continue to act this way, I'll have to report your behavior to your superiors." Rachel's words hit Ethan like a cold slab, but not in a way that made him reflect on his actions. Instead, he felt threatened. To him, the prospect of being reported was an unforgivable humiliation. The thought of Rachel damaging his already fragile reputation made him feel desperate to shut her down before she could act. Ethan's grip tightened on his utility belt, his hand hovering over his baton. For a moment he hesitated, torn between continuing the verbal confrontation or escalating the tension with physical action. Ethan stood frozen for a few seconds, his gaze locked on Rachel. Her refusal felt like an unforgivable challenge. The humiliation and loss of control stoked the fire of his anger. With a resolute movement, he stepped toward Rachel's truck, his eyes flashing with a dangerous determination. "Fine, if you won't let me inspect, I'll do it myself," Ethan shouted, his voice dripping with menace. Without waiting for Rachel's response, he reached for one of the large fire extinguishers lying near the rear of her truck. Rachel immediately stepped forward, trying to stop him. "You can't do that," she yelled, her voice firm yet wary. "These aren't toys. If you don't know how to handle them, you could hurt someone." Ethan ignored her, his hand gripped the handle of the fire extinguisher tightly, yanking it roughly from its mount, but as he pulled, his finger accidentally hit the activation lever. A powerful stream of white powder sprayed out, creating a dense cloud around them. Rachel coughed and stumbled back, trying to avoid inhaling the powder. She waved her hand in front of her face, struggling to see through the thick mist. "I told you," she yelled through her coughing fit. "You don't know what you're doing." Covered in white powder and unable to see clearly, Ethan became even more disoriented and enraged. He staggered a few steps, fumbling with the extinguisher as he tried unsuccessfully to stop the spray. Rachel, sensing the growing danger, stepped Forward reaching for the extinguisher to neutralize it. "Give it to me," Rachel said, her voice firm but not threatening. "You don't know how to turn it off, let me handle it." But Ethan wouldn't yield. In his mind, this was no longer about an inspection or doing his job. It had become a battle for dominance, a battle he couldn't afford to lose. In a fit of rage, he yanked the extinguisher away from Rachel's grasp, forcing her to step back. In his uncontrollable anger, Ethan dropped the extinguisher to the ground. His hand immediately went to his utility belt, pulling out his metal baton with a sharp metallic click. "Don't test me," Ethan roared, pointing the baton at Rachel, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can tell me what to do? I'll show you who's in charge here." Rachel raised her hands in a gesture of peace, though her eyes stayed focused on the baton in Ethan's hand. "Listen, you need to calm down," she said, her voice steady but loud enough to cut through the tension. "I don't want this to escalate any further. Put the baton down and we can talk." Ethan didn't respond. He took a step closer to Rachel, his movements signaling his intent to intimidate her. Rachel could feel the danger growing and her instincts for self-preservation kicked in when Ethan swung the baton at her. Rachel reacted quickly, stepping to the side to avoid the strike. "You don't need to do this," she shouted, her voice a mix of caution and warning. But Ethan had lost all reason. He swung again, harder this time, but Rachel blocked. The guard's presence, a flicker of hope sparked within her, though she knew the guard alone might not be enough to defuse the situation. Still, his presence could provide crucial evidence if things escalated further. Ethan also noticed the guard recording from a distance, and this only fueled his anger. To him, this was no longer just a personal confrontation, it had become a public performance, one where his authority was being questioned. "What are you doing there?" Ethan barked, his voice filled with menace. "Get out of here, this is police business." But the guard didn't leave. He only took a step back to maintain his distance while continuing to record. The defiance of this witness pushed Ethan further into a state of uncontrollable rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Ethan snarled, turning back to Rachel, his face red with anger. "I gave you a chance to cooperate, but all you've done is resist." Before racked, the guard's presence, a flicker of hope sparked within her, though she knew the guard alone might not be enough to defuse the situation. Still, his presence could provide crucial evidence if things escalated further. Ethan also noticed the guard recording from a distance, and this only fueled his anger. To him, this was no longer just a personal confrontation, it had become a public performance, one where his authority was being questioned. "What are you doing there?" Ethan barked, his voice filled with menace. "Get out of here, this is police business." But the guard didn't leave. He only took a step back to maintain his distance while continuing to record. The defiance of this witness pushed Ethan further into a state of uncontrollable rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Ethan snarled, turning back to Rachel, his face red with anger. "I gave you a chance to cooperate, but all you've done is resist." Before Rachel could the wail of police sirens pierced the tense atmosphere of the parking lot, their flashing blue and red lights illuminating the chaotic scene. Rachel, still standing near her truck with the fire extinguisher in hand, exhaled a sigh of relief as the patrol cars approached. Ethan, staggering on the ground, looked up with a mix of anger and fear. He realized the situation had spiraled out of his control, but his stubbornness wouldn't allow him to admit his mistakes. Two officers exited the patrol cars swiftly, one approaching Rachel and the other heading toward Ethan, who was still clutching the taser. They scanned the scene, the security guard recording from a distance, Ethan gripping the taser, and Rachel holding the fire extinguisher, her face marked by traces of pepper spray. The first officer, a woman with a stern expression, raised her hand in a calming gesture. "Everyone, calm down. We need to figure out what happened here." Rachel immediately spoke up, her voice steady despite her labored breathing. "I'm Rachel Carter. I work for Metro Fire Safety Consultants and was completing a fire safety inspection. This officer," she pointed at Ethan, "attacked me without cause. He used excessive force and threatened me repeatedly." The officer glanced at Ethan, who was struggling to get up, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "That's not true," Ethan yelled, desperately trying to redirect attention. "She's dangerous," he shouted, his voice laced with frustration. "She had industrial equipment in her truck, refused to cooperate, and even attacked me. I was just doing my job." Hearing his accusations, Rachel felt a wave of anger rise but quickly suppressed it. She knew her actions now would heavily influence how the officers assessed the situation. "That's not true," Rachel said firmly but calmly. "I have evidence. He sprayed me with pepper spray and threatened me with his baton. He didn't follow any protocol and completely lost control." The security guard, who had been recording the entire incident, stepped closer while maintaining a safe distance. "I have everything on video," he called out. "This will prove she's telling the truth." Ethan, realizing he was being filmed, suddenly lunged toward the security guard, his intention clear, he wanted to grab the phone. But the guard quickly moved, weaving between parked cars to keep his distance, shouting as he went, "You're not getting this. It's already backed up to the cloud. Just stop, you can't escape this." Seizing the distraction, Rachel dashed forward and retrieved the taser from the ground. She held it firmly in her hand, ready to defend herself if Ethan tried to approach her again. The quick reactions of both Rachel and the guard temporarily diffused the immediate threat, but the atmosphere remained thick with tension, like a storm waiting to erupt. The second officer, an older man with sharp eyes, addressed the guard. "Did you get everything on video?" he asked in a serious tone. "Yes," the guard replied, holding up his phone. "I started recording when he pepper sprayed her." The female officer took the phone and began reviewing the footage. As she watched, her expression shifted from focused to cold and unyielding. She turned her gaze to Ethan. "This video clearly shows you using unnecessary force," she said, her voice firm. Ethan tried to defend himself, his voice trembling with desperation. "She was resisting. She refused to obey me. I was just doing what I had to." Recognizing the critical nature of this moment, Rachel stepped forward and added, "I also have a dash camera in my truck. It recorded the entire confrontation from the beginning until now. I'm more than willing to provide the footage." The male officer nodded, his gaze now fixed on Ethan with growing suspicion. "It seems this situation is more complicated than your version of events, Officer Ethan," he said, his tone heavy with authority. Ethan, now cornered, had nothing left to say. Both the witness's video and Rachel's account directly contradicted the narrative he was trying to construct. The realization that his actions were indefensible filled him with anger, but he knew that rage wouldn't save him now. The two officers exchanged a glance, their silent understanding evident. "We need to gather more information," the female officer said, her voice resolute. "But based on what we've seen and the video evidence, it's clear your actions exceeded acceptable boundaries." Rachel, standing tall and composed, felt the tension in the air begin to ease. She knew this was just the beginning of a long investigation, but for the first time, the truth had started to emerge. The parking lot, bathed in the strobing lights of the patrol cars, carried an air of judgment. Rachel stood near her truck, her face firm despite the exhaustion etched across it. Ethan, his expression still marred by anger, now remained silent, though the worry in his eyes betrayed his growing realization that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Rachel moved cautiously toward her truck, maintaining a safe distance from Ethan. She opened the door and retrieved the dash cam mounted on the dashboard, carefully removing the memory card. She handed it to the female officer, who had just reviewed the security guard's footage. "I record everything as part of my job," Rachel said, her voice clear but devoid of challenge. "This will prove that my account is accurate. He attacked me, and I only defended myself." The female officer accepted the memory card and quickly connected it to a device to view the footage. The video played out in stark detail, showing Ethan stepping out of his patrol car with suspicion, escalating the encounter by using pepper spray and a taser, and Rachel's attempts to remain calm and defend herself throughout the ordeal. The officers watched in silence, the evidence speaking louder than any words. The recording didn't just clarify Ethan's actions, it highlighted Rachel's composure and efforts to de-escalate in an overwhelmingly tense situation. When the video ended, the male officer turned to Ethan, his expression severe. "Ethan, do you have anything to say? Because what we've seen doesn't align with your original statement." Ethan stiffened, his body rigid as he struggled to form a response. Words failed him, and the anger etched on his face gradually gave way to disappointment and shame. Rachel took a deep breath, composing herself before recounting the incident. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of the tension she had endured. "I was simply doing my job, inspecting the fire safety system in the mall, when he arrived. I explained everything clearly and provided my documentation, but he didn't believe me. Things escalated when he started using force." She paused for a moment, meeting the female officer's gaze directly. "I didn't want any of this to happen. I tried to explain, to stay calm, and keep things under control, but he wouldn't listen. I defended myself because I had no other choice. I didn't want to hurt him, but if I hadn't acted, I don't know what might have happened." Rachel's words softened the atmosphere slightly. The officers nodded, their expressions shifting to one of understanding. They recognized that Rachel had done everything in her power to avoid conflict, but Ethan's impulsive actions had pushed the situation out of control. The female officer nodded, her voice maintaining a professional tone but with a hint of reassurance. "Miss Carter, we've reviewed the evidence and your testimony. From what we've seen, your actions were within your right to self-defense. We'll document everything and continue our investigation." Ethan, standing a few steps away, tried to interject. "This isn't fair. She provoked me. I was just doing my job." But the male officer cut him off, his voice firm and commanding. "Ethan, stop. From the evidence we've reviewed, it's clear that your actions were inappropriate and a serious breach of protocol. We'll be reporting this to your superiors for further action." Rachel felt some of the weight in her chest lift, though she knew this was far from over. While the officers showed empathy and acknowledged the evidence in her favor, she was aware there would be further interviews and an extended investigation. The atmosphere in the parking lot was thick with tension and gravity. Ethan, disheveled and visibly exhausted, sat slumped on the ground, clutching his shoulder where Rachel had countered his assault. The sound of an approaching ambulance echoed through the still night, underscoring the severity of the situation. 2 paramedics stepped out of the ambulance and quickly moved toward Ethan to assess his injuries. Accompanying them was another officer, whose authoritative and cold demeanor made it clear he was in charge. He spoke firmly, "Ethan Bradley, you will be taken for medical evaluation, but I advise you to prepare for a thorough investigation. The evidence is undeniable." Ethan looked up, his expression a mix of anger and despair. He opened his mouth to protest, but the officer cut him off sharply. "Silence, Ethan. Anything you say now will only worsen your situation. We will document this incident thoroughly and escalate it to the appropriate authorities. Your actions tonight are inexcusable." Ethan was helped onto a stretcher by the paramedics. Despite his physical pain, his eyes burned with defiance as he glanced at Rachel from a distance. "You won't get away with this," he muttered under his breath, low enough that only he could hear. Rachel stood near her truck, still holding the fire extinguisher she had used to defend herself. Her face was unreadable, masking the exhaustion that was beginning to take hold. Yet her resolute posture and unwavering gaze spoke volumes, exuding integrity that the other officers couldn't help but notice. As Ethan was loaded into the ambulance, the female officer turned back to Rachel, her voice gentle but professional. "Miss Carter, we've gathered all the evidence we need for now, but we'll require a more detailed statement from you in the coming days. Are you willing to cooperate?" Rachel nodded, her voice steady though tinged with fatigue. "I'm ready. I don't want anyone else to go through this. If cooperating with the investigation will help uncover the truth, I'll do everything I can." Rachel's calm and cooperative demeanor stood in stark contrast to Ethan's disarray and instability as he was lifted into the ambulance. Though no words were exchanged, the officers shared glances of mutual agreement. Rachel's account aligned perfectly with the evidence. One of the officers gave Rachel a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent gesture of respect. "We'll ensure this case is handled fairly, Miss Carter." Rachel felt a slight weight lift from her chest, though she knew this was only the beginning. She would have to face the lengthy investigation ahead as well as the possibility that Ethan might attempt to twist the narrative to save himself. Despite her weariness, Rachel refused to falter. She watched as the ambulance pulled away, taking Ethan and part of the night's story with it. As the flashing blue and red lights faded into the distance, Rachel spoke softly but resolutely. "I won't let anyone distort the truth. This isn't just about protecting myself, it's about justice." The officers, inspired by her determination, continued their work, finalizing the incident report. Rachel stood for a few moments longer, feeling the stillness gradually return to the parking lot. Though the ordeal was far from over, she knew she had done the right thing. As the red and blue lights of the police and ambulance vehicles faded in her rearview mirror, Rachel felt a wave of emotion swell within her. On the drive home, the quiet night outside contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Rachel wondered how many others had faced similar situations, abused by authority, falsely accused, and forced to fight for their truth. She realized how fortunate she was to have had evidence, witnesses, and the determination to stand up against injustice. Not everyone gets the chance I had, she thought, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. How many people have been crushed by people like Ethan, unable to defend themselves because they lacked evidence or were too afraid to speak up? Yet Rachel didn't feel bitter. Instead, she felt proud. She had done the right thing, not just to protect herself but to send a message that no one, not even those in positions of power, is above the law. She recalled the look in Ethan's eyes before he was loaded into the ambulance, a mixture of rage, humiliation, and helplessness. She knew Ethan and perhaps his supporters wouldn't let this go easily. But Rachel wasn't afraid. She believed in the truth and was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. When she arrived home, Rachel parked in front of her house. The warm glow of the porch light illuminated her face, softening the tension still lingering from the night's ordeal. She stepped out, closed the car door, and stood still for a moment. Her house, peaceful and quiet, was a stark contrast to what she had just endured. Looking up at the sky, where stars sparkled in the darkness, Rachel felt a sense of calm wash over her. Taking a deep breath, she let the cool night air fill her lungs, easing some of the fatigue. Her thoughts shifted beyond herself to the sense of responsibility she now felt. Every small action can spark change, she thought to herself. And if I don't take action, who will? The story closed with Rachel standing in front of her home, her hands relaxed at her sides but her eyes filled with determination. She wasn't just a survivor of that night, she was a voice for her story, one that was not only hers but also for those who couldn't speak out. A week after the incident, Rachel received a call from her company's director, Michael Grant. His warm and appreciative voice resonated through the phone. "Rachel, I want you to know how proud we are of how you handled the situation. You not only protected yourself but maintained professionalism in an incredibly difficult circumstance. The company has decided to nominate you for the Bravest Employee of the Year award." Rachel felt a surge of emotion but responded modestly. "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing what I had to do." In another development, Ethan Bradley was officially suspended pending the results of an internal investigation. Reports of the incident spread, and Ethan found himself not only facing criticism from colleagues but also the looming possibility of prosecution. The case served as a stark reminder that the abuse of power is never tolerable. After the call ended, Rachel sat in her small home office, feeling a quiet sense of pride. She had not only stood up for herself but also inspired others to fight against injustice. For Rachel, a new journey had begun, and this time, she was ready. Rachel's story is not just a lesson in courage but a powerful reminder of the strength of truth and justice. She proved that even in the most unfair and dangerous situations, determination and integrity can make all the difference. In the weeks following the incident, Rachel found herself at the center of a growing conversation about accountability in law enforcement and the abuse of authority. Her story, bolstered by the security guard's footage and her own dashcam evidence, quickly gained traction on social media. Advocacy groups and media outlets reached out to her, eager to amplify her experience as an example of resilience and justice. Despite the growing attention, Rachel remained focused on her work and the ongoing investigation. She spent hours recounting the events to investigators, ensuring every detail was documented accurately. The officers handling her case were thorough, and though the process was exhausting, Rachel was determined to see it through. Meanwhile, Ethan Bradley faced increasing scrutiny. The internal investigation revealed a troubling pattern of behavior in his record: instances of excessive force, questionable judgment, and complaints from civilians that had been ignored or dismissed. The department, under public pressure, announced Ethan's suspension without pay and began proceedings for his termination. Rachel received messages of support from colleagues and strangers alike. Some thanked her for standing up against abuse of power, while others shared their own stories of mistreatment, inspired by her courage. Each message reinforced her belief in the importance of speaking out. One evening, Rachel attended a community forum organized by a local advocacy group. The event aimed to address systemic issues within law enforcement and provide a platform for individuals like Rachel to share their experiences. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Rachel's heart raced, but she steadied herself, gripping the microphone. "Thank you for having me here tonight," she began, her voice strong and clear. What happened to me wasn't just about one officer's actions, it's about a system that allows such behavior to go unchecked. I was fortunate to have evidence and witnesses on my side, but I know not everyone is so lucky. We need accountability, transparency, and change." The audience erupted into applause, and as Rachel continued, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced before. She spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity, and the power of community in driving meaningful change. After the forum, Rachel was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Mia. With tears in her eyes, Mia shared her own story of being mistreated by an officer but feeling powerless to act. "Your courage gave me the strength to speak out," Mia said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for being an inspiration." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out and took Mia's hand. "You're not alone in this. Keep speaking your truth, and together, we'll make a difference." As the months passed, Rachel's case became a catalyst for broader discussions about police reform in her city. New policies were introduced, including mandatory de-escalation training, increased oversight, and mechanisms for civilians to report misconduct anonymously. Ethan Bradley, stripped of his badge, faced criminal charges for his actions that night. Though the trial was emotionally taxing for Rachel, she attended every hearing, determined to see justice served. When the verdict came, a conviction for misconduct and assault, Rachel felt a sense of closure. But her journey didn't end there. Rachel continued to advocate for justice and equity, partnering with organizations to improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. Her work extended beyond her field of fire safety, as she became a voice for those who felt unheard. Years later, Rachel reflected on that pivotal night in the parking lot. It had tested her in ways she never imagined but also revealed her strength and resilience. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but she remained steadfast, knowing her actions had sparked change and inspired others to do the same. Rachel's advocacy work gradually gained momentum, leading her to become a well-known figure in her community. She was invited to speak at conferences, schools, and town halls, where her story resonated with people from all walks of life. Each event brought new opportunities to address the critical need for accountability and systemic change. One of her most significant breakthroughs came when a group of policymakers invited her to join a task force dedicated to reforming local law enforcement practices. The committee included community leaders, activists, and officers who genuinely wanted to rebuild trust between law enforcement and civilians. Rachel initially hesitated, unsure if she was prepared for such a monumental task. However, Michael Grant, her company director, encouraged her. "Rachel, you've shown incredible courage and integrity. If anyone can bring real-world experience and a balanced perspective to this task force, it's you," he said during a meeting in her office. With that support, Rachel agreed to join the task force. The work was challenging, filled with debates, differing opinions, and resistance from certain factions, but Rachel stayed committed to finding solutions. Her input, especially her first-hand experience, became instrumental in shaping new policies. One of the key proposals she championed was the establishment of a civilian review board. This board, composed of community members, would have the authority to investigate complaints against law enforcement officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. Though the idea faced initial pushback, Rachel's persistence and well-reasoned arguments gradually won over the committee. Outside of her advocacy work, Rachel's personal life began to flourish. The strength and determination she had demonstrated inspired those around her, deepening her relationships with friends and family. Her sister, Maya, often reminded her, "You've become a symbol of hope for so many people. I hope you realize how much you've changed lives." One day, Rachel received an email from a young man named Jordan. He was a law student who had watched her speak at a community forum. In his email, Jordan wrote about how Rachel's story inspired him to specialize in civil rights law. "Your courage has shown me what it truly means to fight for justice," Jordan wrote. "Thank you for reminding me why this work matters." Rachel responded warmly, offering encouragement and sharing her gratitude. Moments like this reaffirmed her belief that even the smallest acts of bravery could ripple outward, influencing countless lives. The changes Rachel fought for started to take root. the Civilian Review Board was established, de-escalation training became mandatory for officers, and community engagement programs were launched to rebuild trust. Rachel often participated in these programs, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. Ethan Bradley, on the other hand, faced the consequences of his actions. Though he initially tried to appeal his conviction, his efforts were unsuccessful. He eventually disappeared from public view, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. Years later, Rachel was invited to an awards ceremony hosted by a national advocacy group. To her surprise, she was being honored for her contributions to justice and community reform. As she stood on stage, holding the plaque inscribed with her name, she looked out at the audience, a sea of faces filled with admiration and hope. "This award isn't just for me," Rachel said into the microphone, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "It's for everyone who has ever stood up for what's right, even when it was hard. It's for those who couldn't find their voice and for those who are just beginning to speak out. Together, we can create a world where justice isn't just an ideal but a reality for everyone." The applause that followed was thunderous, a testament to the impact Rachel had made. As she left the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that began in a lonely parking lot on a dark night had transformed not only her life but also the lives of so many others. Rachel's story became a powerful reminder that one person's courage could ignite change and that standing up for justice was always worth the fight. As Rachel continued her journey as an advocate for justice and reform, her influence extended beyond her local community. Invitations poured in for her to speak at national conferences and to participate in workshops aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. One such invitation was to deliver the keynote address at a national summit on police reform held in Washington, D.C. The summit brought together leaders from across the country, law enforcement officials, policymakers, community activists, and victims of systemic injustice. Standing on the grand stage of the convention center, Rachel looked out at the packed audience. She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I stand before you today not as an expert, but as a survivor and an advocate," Rachel began, her voice steady. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that, for too long, has prioritized authority over accountability. But we are here today because we believe that can change." Her speech delved into her personal story, the reforms she had fought for, and the importance of holding power accountable. She spoke passionately about the need for empathy, transparency, and community-driven solutions. "We must move beyond us versus them," Rachel emphasized. "Law enforcement and communities are not adversaries. We are partners in creating a safe and just society. But that partnership must be built on trust, respect, and accountability." The audience gave her a standing ovation, and many approached her afterward to thank her for her candor and insight. Among them was a seasoned police chief named Marcus Holden, who had been a staunch advocate for progressive reforms within his department. "Rachel, your words resonated deeply with me," Chief Holden said, shaking her hand. "I've been in this profession for 30 years, and I've seen the best and worst it has to offer. People like you remind us why we must always strive to do better." Their conversation led to an unexpected opportunity. Chief Holden invited Rachel to collaborate on a training program for officers in his department, focusing on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. It was a groundbreaking initiative, and Rachel gladly accepted. The program, named Bridging the Divide, was a resounding success. Officers who participated reported a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the communities they served. Rachel's involvement earned widespread praise, and other departments began adopting similar models. Amid her advocacy work, Rachel also made time for personal growth and healing. She started practicing yoga and meditation to manage the lingering anxiety from the traumatic night in the parking lot. She also joined a support group for individuals who had faced abuse of power, finding solace in sharing her experiences and learning from others. One day, Rachel received a surprise email from a film producer. Inspired by her story and its widespread impact, the producer wanted to create a documentary highlighting her journey and the reforms it had sparked. Rachel hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted her life to be further exposed. But after consulting with friends and colleagues, she agreed, recognizing the potential to inspire others on a larger scale. The documentary, titled Unbroken, The Rachel Carter Story, premiered a year later. It combined interviews with Rachel, the security guard, and others involved in her case with dramatized reenactments of the events. The film was both harrowing and uplifting, showcasing Rachel's resilience and the systemic changes her actions had set in motion. The documentary received critical acclaim and was screened at film festivals across the country. More importantly, it became a tool for education, used in schools, community centers, and police departments to spark conversations about justice and reform. As Rachel watched the impact of her story ripple outward, she reflected on how far she had come. What had begun as a terrifying confrontation in a dark parking lot had evolved into a movement for accountability and change. Rachel knew her work was far from over. She continued to advocate, educate, and inspire, always driven by the belief that justice was worth fighting for. And as she looked toward the future, she felt a deep sense of hope that the seeds of change she had planted would grow into a stronger, more equitable world for all. As Unbroken, the Rachel Carter story gained widespread recognition, Rachel found herself navigating an entirely new platform of influence. The documentary opened doors to partnerships with global organizations, extending her advocacy beyond national borders. She became a sought-after speaker at international conferences addressing human rights, systemic reform, and the protection of marginalized communities. One of these opportunities took Rachel to Geneva, Switzerland, where she was invited to speak at a United Nations Forum on Justice and Accountability. Surrounded by dignitaries, policymakers, and activists from around the world, Rachel felt a profound sense of responsibility. Standing at the podium, she began with the same authenticity that had always defined her. "I come from a suburban neighborhood in the United States, but the story I share is not unique to where I live. Across the globe, unchecked power and systemic failures have silenced too many voices. Today, we're here to ensure that those voices are heard." Rachel detailed her experience and the lessons learned from her journey. She emphasized the universality of her message: accountability must be a cornerstone of any just society. Her words resonated deeply, sparking discussions that continued well beyond the conference hall. Following the event, representatives from various NGOs approached her, eager to collaborate. Rachel began working with an international coalition to develop resources and training programs for law enforcement agencies worldwide. She co-authored a guide on ethical policing, which was translated into multiple languages and distributed to departments in over 30 countries. Back home, Rachel's community work continued to evolve. She started a nonprofit organization called the Carter Initiative, dedicated to empowering individuals who had faced abuse of authority. The organization provided legal support, mental health resources, and advocacy training, helping victims reclaim their lives and stand up for their rights. Through the initiative, Rachel met people like David, a young father who had been falsely accused and struggled to clear his name. With the help of the Carter Initiative, David not only won his case but also became an advocate for others in similar situations. "Rachel, you didn't just help me," David told her one day after a community meeting. "You gave me the courage to fight for my family and for everyone who's been told their voice doesn't matter." Moments like these fueled Rachel's resolve. She expanded the nonprofit's reach, opening satellite offices in neighboring cities and launching a mentorship program for young advocates. Meanwhile, Rachel's work with law enforcement reform also gained traction. She developed an immersive training program that placed officers in simulated high-stress scenarios, encouraging them to practice de-escalation and empathy. Departments reported positive outcomes, with significant decreases in complaints and use of force incidents. Despite her successes, Rachel faced challenges. Critics, particularly those resistant to reform, accused her of vilifying law enforcement. She encountered online harassment and even received threats from anonymous sources. But Rachel refused to be deterred. She surrounded herself with a strong support system of friends, family, and colleagues who reminded her of the importance of her work. Her sister, Maya, often acted as her confidant, offering words of encouragement during tough times. "You faced worse, Rach," Maya would say with a knowing smile. "And you came out stronger every time. This is no different." One of the most significant milestones in Rachel's journey came 3 years after the incident in the parking lot. She was invited to testify before Congress during a hearing on police reform. The hearing was a pivotal moment, as lawmakers debated comprehensive legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues in law enforcement. Rachel's testimony was powerful and deeply personal. She recounted her ordeal, the changes it had inspired, and the ongoing need for accountability. Her words brought some lawmakers to tears and earned her bipartisan praise. The reforms passed later that year, including measures to improve transparency, strengthen civilian oversight, and mandate de-escalation training nationwide. Rachel's role in shaping the legislation was widely acknowledged, cementing her legacy as a changemaker. As she reflected on the journey, Rachel understood that her impact extended far beyond her own story. She had become a catalyst for change, inspiring others to speak out, challenge injustice, and demand better from their institutions. Her story didn't end with these victories, it continued to evolve as she worked tirelessly to build a world where justice was not a privilege but a right for everyone. As Rachel's influence grew, so did her aspirations. She understood that systemic change required both grassroots efforts and institutional transformation. She decided to expand the Carter Initiative by creating partnerships with academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, and community organizations. One such partnership was with a prominent university, where Rachel helped establish the Institute for Justice and Community Leadership. The institute focused on research, training, and dialogue to address systemic injustices and foster understanding between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Rachel served as a visiting lecturer, teaching courses on ethical leadership and the power of grassroots advocacy. Her classes quickly became some of the most popular on campus. Students from diverse backgrounds flocked to her lectures, inspired by her first-hand experience and unwavering commitment to justice. Rachel encouraged open discussions, challenging her students to think critically and empathetically about the world around them. One day after class, a student named Emma approached Rachel. Emma was studying criminal justice and had been conflicted about whether to pursue a career in law enforcement. "Professor Carter," Emma began, her voice filled with uncertainty, "I've always wanted to be a police officer to make a difference, but sometimes I wonder if one person can really change a system that feels so broken." Rachel smiled warmly. "Emma, I asked myself the same question many times. But if I've learned anything, it's that change starts with individuals willing to stand up for what's right. Systems don't change overnight, but they do change when people like you decide to be part of the solution." Emma nodded, visibly moved. "Thank you. I think I needed to hear that." Moments like this reminded Rachel why she had chosen to share her story and dedicate herself to teaching. She believed in empowering the next generation to take on the challenges of justice and equity with courage and compassion. Meanwhile, the Carter Initiative continued to grow. The organization launched a series of workshops aimed at educating communities about their rights and how to navigate encounters with law enforcement. These workshops were held in schools, community centers, and even online, reaching thousands of people. Rachel also worked tirelessly to address the mental health challenges faced by victims of abuse. She partnered with therapists and counselors to create a trauma support program, ensuring that survivors had access to the resources they needed to heal. In addition to her advocacy and teaching, Rachel took steps to preserve her own well-being. She found solace in her hobbies, such as painting and hiking, which allowed her to recharge amidst the demands of her work. Her sister, Maya, often joined her on weekend hikes, and the two shared moments of laughter and reflection. "You know, Rach," Maya said during one hike, "I've always admired your determination, but I'm even more proud of how you've stayed true to yourself through all of this." Rachel smiled. "I couldn't have done it without the people around me. You've been my rock, Maya." As the years passed, Rachel's impact continued to ripple outward. She received numerous awards and accolades, including a humanitarian award from a prestigious global organization. But for Rachel, the true reward was seeing tangible change, policies reformed, communities empowered, and lives transformed. One of her proudest moments came when she attended the graduation ceremony of a new police academy class that had adopted her training program. As she watched the cadets take their oath, she felt a deep sense of hope. "Today marks a new chapter," Rachel said during her speech at the ceremony. "You have the opportunity to be the change we need to serve with integrity, compassion, and accountability. The future of justice starts with each of you." Her words were met with a standing ovation, and several graduates approached her afterward to express their gratitude.